We're in Genesis 16. So we just had in Genesis 15, God sort of finalizing his covenant with Abraham. So that was the way it finished. And then in 16, it starts right out by saying, that Sarah had not had any children, but it does actually say that he'd been in Canaan 10 years. So I don't know how long everything else happened. I'm sure there are scholars that try to make these exact, but it's clearly at least years that this has happened. So it's been some time, and they don't have any offspring yet. So Sarai says, here, take the slave. Probably is common at that time. She was hoping to sort of adopt the child, maybe. But what happens is Hagar becomes pregnant, and basically Hagar becomes kind of obnoxious and kind of acting like a donkey in some cases, right? Which seemed kind of weird. She was the slave, right? How does this happen? But there are, if you get into Deuteronomy, obviously this is before the law, but you can sort of project the customs and other things backwards, I guess, and sort of say that there are actually rules that if you take a slave as a wife, and there are rules for what you have to do. You have to provide for her materially. You have to provide for her kids, and you have to provide conjugal rights and some other stuff that goes on, right? So the slave girl could become, fairly obnoxious, and she did. So then Sarai goes to Abram and says, "You're responsible for my suffering. I put my slave, and then I became contemptible to her. May the Lord judge between me and you." So in modern parlance, we would often look at that and sort of be like, "Hey, you asked for this." But she is exactly right. It's the same as Adam. When we covered that in Genesis 1, is that Abram is meant to be to lead and protect his wife, and he should have, like we finished in chapter 15 talking about that how Abram believed the Lord, acted as if that was true. He acted in faith, and God credited it to him as righteousness. And he said, "Look, you are acting in faith that what I say goes." And then his wife comes to him and says, "Hey, this whole plan of God's not working out. I have an alternate plan." And Abram's like, "Yep, sure." No, he should have said immediately, "No, that is not the way." So it's a larger picture thing. People often talk about, multiple wives and marriages in the Old Testament. It is something that is allowed, but it is clearly through the whole Old Testament. It almost always leads to issues. So it's not the ideal. And as you get to Jesus in the New Testament, he sort of reapplies that and says, "This isn't the way it was meant to be." So that was sort of an acquiescence that was in the Old Testament, but it's not the ideal plan. As you can imagine, having multiple wives is probably not an ideal plan. It's not going to go well for you, is my guess, and it never does in the Old Testament. So that is true. And Abram does the great leadership tactic, and Manly takes on his role and says, "Oh, well, if you're not happy, then you can do whatever you want to her," which is probably not the ideal answer either. So Hagar runs away, and the angel of the Lord, which is a rabbit hole we won't go down, but a lot of people chit chat. It's not a huge one, but lots of people go down. So is that the Lord? Is that the angel of the Lord? Is that Jesus? Is that some other figure? So there's lots of discussions about the angel of the Lord. But the angel of the Lord appears in multiple texts. This isn't the only one. To Hagar, and says, "What's going on?" She says, "I'm running away from my mistress." And the angel says, "Go back and submit to her authority," right? Go back and behave, and I will greatly multiply your offspring. There will be too many to count. So interestingly, often Jesus picks sort of an either or, and you'd think in this case where they were unfaithful, that he would do that, but he has mercy, and he actually does choose to bless Ishmael in some levels. And it says, you'll have a son, name him Ishmael. He will be like a wild donkey, right? He's going to be, to a certain extent, like you, and he's going to have his hand against everyone, but he will settle near his relatives, and he will have many generations and create quite a people. This is sort of an interesting one. So she named the Lord who spoke to her, "You are El Roi," which means God sees me. So, and then the place is named that, but it's sort of an interesting, she tries to rename God. But anyway, they name the well there, Bir Lahai Roy, which basically says the place where you were seen. Um, so, and then she gives birth to Ishmael. So that is chapter 16. And then you jump into, hopefully, chapter 17. And it says, when Abram was 99 years old. So we go a little bit further along. Um, and God appears to him and says, I am God Almighty, which is El Shaddai. If you wonder where we get that term, it's actually God Almighty. El is God, typically translated God. And Almighty is, they're actually not super clear as I understand it in Hebrew, what Shaddai means, but that's the general consensus is Almighty. It obviously means something like that, the way it's used. But the exact word or wording, but El Shaddai means roughly God Almighty. So if you wonder where that term comes from, that is it. That is the first use of it. In my presence and be blameless. I will set up my covenant and multiply you greatly. So God is appearing again, reiterating the covenant again, right? And he's saying you should be living blameless. Now he hasn't been giving the law, but he can live in righteousness by living in faith to what God has told him, right? So God falls down. So Abram falls down on his face. And God says, I'm going to give you a covenant and you'll be the father of many nations. So that's an interesting sort of comment. The greatest blessing God can give is having generations of kids. And I think if you talk to any like grandparents that have lots of grandkids, they probably would agree with you. And yet somehow in our culture nowadays, it's looked at as a hassle or sort of a strange thing that, oh, well, you're going to have all those kids or whatever. And you're sort of focused on yourself instead and just, enjoy your own time, your own whatever, rather than saying, hey, well, let's build for generations. And when you have lots of grandkids, that'll be awesome. That's a blessing from God. So I will confirm my covenant that is between me and your future offspring throughout the generations. Sorry. It's a permanent covenant to be your God and God of your offspring after you. And then God also said to Abram, as for you. So there is a conditional statement in this, right? And it says you're to keep my covenant. So the covenant can be summarized quite simply, right? God summarizes, Jesus summarizes the law by saying that, love God with all your heart, mind, soul, strength, everything you got, and love your neighbor as yourself. And that's sort of the summary. Now, there's a lot more detail when you get to the 10 Commandments, and then there's more detail as you get into, working that out in everyday life. You got to expand that and extend that and whatever. So there's a lot more to it, but that's how he sort of boils it down to a simple thing. The covenants, same type of thing. They can get very complicated. They go back and forth. But if you were to summarize it down in a simple saying, it is, I will be your God if you will be my people. It's a reciprocal thing to say, like, look, if you make me your God, then I will be your God and you will be my people, which is great. Right? So that's what he's saying here. Look, if you keep my covenant, if you make me your God, then I will do that, right? And if that is the case, then he gives them a sign and he says, every one of you should be circumcised, right? Now, this is a visible sign of that covenant. So it's a sign that says, hey, by the way, if you want to partake in this covenant, you need, often covenants have a sign that is given to go with that. And that will be this circumcision. Now, as we get to the new covenant, when Jesus comes and he finally finishes, there's several situations where it talks about having a circumcised heart, right? So as you get to the New Testament, God is saying, look, I gave you that law because I had to. It exposed your sin. It gives you guidance on how to make laws. It does all of these things. But what I really want is for your heart to be transformed and actually want to do the things that are that are in the law, right? And that's all of what we've been reading in Matthew is, hey, by the way, there's this new covenant. I want to write those laws on your heart. It's not about don't murder. It's about what's in your heart condition. You shouldn't be getting angry at people. You shouldn't be having that rage in your heart. It's not a matter of don't cross this line or that line. It's what's in your heart. So the phrase that's used numerous times is, do you have a circumcised heart? Right? So that is basically the sign sort of saying, like, you are God's chosen people, then therefore your heart should be transformed, right? So Sarah gets a new name, Sarai, and kings and peoples will come from her. Abraham fell face down and he laughed because he is promised a child, right? And he says, ha, can a child be born to a 100-year-old man? Can Sarah, my 90-year-old woman, give birth? So he says to God, if only Ishmael were acceptable to you, right? So Abraham is saying, well, at least I have a son, right? But God said, no, no, no. Your wife will bear you a son. You will name him Isaac. And I will confirm my covenant with him as a permanent covenant for his future offspring, right? And it says he does actually say that I will bless Ishmael, right? In verse 20, as for Ishmael, I have heard you, I will bless him. But in 21, he reiterates, but I will confirm my covenant with Isaac. Right? So that's a pretty clear line by God to sort of say, this is my my people are going through this branch. But in his mercy, he actually does bless Ishmael to some level with generations and people. So that is a little bit more of the covenant. Like I said, the covenants get very complicated, can be simplified down to you be my God, I'll be your people. But as you work through them and as they are revealed through the Bible, there's lots of steps and twists and turns and aspects of it that keep getting revealed and expanded. So, and this is one of them. In the New Testament, there are some comparisons, and that's an interesting, that's the debate about who should be baptized and when and how old and all of that type of stuff often comes around this discussion here because baptism is compared to circumcision. So the New Testament, they compare baptism in many ways to the circumcision. So even children are circumcised, right, at 8 days old. So that is the argument pro early baptism is largely based on this fact as you're going. And then if you are a later baptism type of person, you would reference the more of the scriptures that say you need to accept Jesus and make a distinct understanding of his lordship in order to get that blessing. So that's that debate if you want to get into it. So that is it for Genesis 16 and 17. Hope you enjoyed. God bless.